All right. Welcome to the Bookly Podcast. Welcome back, hopefully, to the Bookly Podcast. Hopefully this isn't your first go at it with me. And if it is, actually, take that back. Hopefully this is your first go at it with the Bookly Podcast and you stick around for more. That's the goal. So thank you for everyone who has been saying good things about the podcast, who's been sharing the podcast. We've had, a little bit of growth over the past couple weeks. It's been fun to watch, and we've actually got a couple new guests scheduled, and we've got, I think, my first random person guest coming on in 2 weeks, I believe. And so that should be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how I handle it, because most people that I've talked to so far have been friends, family, or at least acquaintances. And so it'll be a little bit different to talk to somebody completely out of the blue and try to engage with them and do the whole interview style thing. I don't know. I just think it's going to be fun. This is what I kind of envisioned for the podcast, was to get to know new people, new perspectives, and also just to learn and grow with new people. So I'm excited for it, a little bit worried, but I think it should go well. And for anybody who did not watch last week's episode, we did a remote podcast for the first time with Adam. Sorry, that really hurt. I messed up my rib at jiu-jitsu this last week, and I am like dying. I had to sleep upright for 2 days because I couldn't lay down, and now every time I hiccup or burp or do anything, move my ribs in any manner, I feel like I'm going to die. So if for any reason I pause and grab my rib, that's why. Really, really unfortunate. But yeah, last week I did my first episode with a remote podcast episode with Adam. We did the one about the Comanches, Empire of the Summer Moon. If you have not listened to that one, it was really fun. It was really interesting. The remote podcast worked pretty well. We're going to get better and better at it. I've got a few more remote guests lined up, and then I just need to start reaching out to people who are remote. So if you are anywhere now in the world, we can do a podcast together. And hopefully we can still get people into the studio. I mean, we built the studio and we want people to come to it, but ultimately I just want to talk to interesting individuals and read books. And the book this week was an interesting book. So this week's book was Crime and Punishment. And when I first made my list of books for the year, there were quite a few people that messaged me and were like, Crime and Punishment, really? That's going to be rough. That's going to be rough. And I kind of just blew them off. I blew them off mostly because I was like, I can read any book. No book's going to be a hard book. And then I also blew them off because so many people that I listen to recommend Crime and Punishment, recommend Dostoevsky as a whole and Russian literature actually as a whole, and then Dostoevsky, and then on more specifically Crime and Punishment. So Jordan Peterson, basically, I'm going to have a quote here from him. He said that I highly recommend all 5 of his, referring to Dostoevsky's, novels because they are unparalleled in their psychological depth. He goes on and on and on about basically anything that Dostoevsky has written. I know Lex Friedman, obviously, because he's Russian himself, has quite a bit to say about him. There are definitely other podcasters that I listen to and other individuals who have also said a lot about him. And so I just kind of assumed that I would go into it and just be instantly hooked and that I would love it. And that was not the case, for sure. This was probably one of the hardest books that I've had here on the Bookly Podcast. And by hardest books, I mean Saturday night, I had to have a sit down and, really map out my priorities moment and decide whether or not I was going to DNF this book and it be the first DNF that I've done with the Bookly Podcast. I seriously considered just recording an episode on Saturday and being like, well, I hated this book and I'm not finishing it. But I made I know that's dumb because it's fine. I don't judge anybody who doesn't finish books. I don't care if you finish books or not. But for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to not finish this book. Maybe had it been a different book, I would have been like, I don't care. I don't want to finish this book. But a little bit of my pride and my ego was hurt just a little bit and thinking like, I'm not going to be the kind of person that can't get through Crime and Punishment. Although now looking back on it, I completely understand why people can't get through Crime and Punishment because it's dense. And not only is it dense, there are sections of it that are really not entertaining at all. And my overall opinion of this book. So before I go over my overall opinion, I want to read again, I'm trying to start every episode with the summary of the book, and then we can start diving into it. That way people who have not read the book or people who haven't read it in a really long time can get a quick refresher of the book and have a little bit of background information before we start diving in. So this is the one paragraph summary of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov, a destitute and desperate former student, wanders through the slums of St. Petersburg and commits a random murder without remorse or regret. He imagines himself to be a great man, a Napoleon, acting for a higher purpose beyond conventional moral law. But as he embarks on a dangerous game of cat and mouse with a suspicious police investigator, Raskolnikov is pursued by the growing voice of his conscience and finds the noose of his own guilt tightening around his neck. Only Sonia, a downtrodden sex worker, can offer the chance of redemption. So that description sounds like a page turner. Like, if the book was actually that, I feel like I would have been way more into it. But this is such a deceptive paragraph about this book because I don't think that's at all what this book is about. This book is a psychological examination of a set of values as one becomes atheist, nihilistic, egotistical, and materialistic. And that's it. That's all this book is. It is a very almost introspective book, and it's almost like a psychological theory analysis is really all it is. And so if you're not really into kind of philosophy, psychology, or even, just kind of the study of the effects of ideologies in general, then this book is going to be incredibly boring because it is not at all the action-packed cat and mouse dangerous game with a suspicious police investigator. No. The police investigator is barely in this book. I mean, barely in this book. For our book that is like 20 hours long or 500 pages or however long it is, the police investigator plays a very, very minor role in this book. And then, all the rest of this is just, not what I would have labeled this as. But after reading this book and after forcing myself to finish Crime and Punishment, I can say I appreciate what it is. I appreciate what it is for what it is. And I know that that's a very weird way of saying that, but I do appreciate the greatness of this book. I appreciate the thought that went into this book and the concepts that are tackled in this book. What I will say is I had more fun researching this book after reading it. And I had more fun listening to other people talk about this book than I did actually reading this book. Reading this book was painful for me. I don't know about you guys, but every once in a while there's just either parts of books or books in whole where you can read an entire chapter or listen to 10 minutes of the book And then you get to the end and you realize I have no idea what happened during this chapter, or I have no idea what happened during that last 10 minutes. And I felt like this happened constantly in this book. I had to like sit down and be like, Brandon, focus. Do not think about anything else. And then I'd start listening to this book and I'd start going and my mind would just go somewhere else, completely gone. And then I'd look back at my phone and I'd be like, crap, I just listened to 15 minutes of this book. I have to rewind it and restart. I was doing that constantly, which for a 20-hour book turns it from like a 20-hour book to like a 26-hour book. And that's kind of hard to do in a week, which is another reason why I thought I'm just not going to finish this book, because on Saturday I was like, I don't know, probably 15 hours deep into it, but realistically only 10 hours deep into, or like 12 hours deep into the actual audiobook. And so I was like halfway done. I was like, man, I really should be like 2/3 of the way done, if not 3/4 of the way done. But I had to keep going back because I had no idea what was going on in the book. And it was really, really frustrating. I just couldn't get into it. I don't know. It just wasn't it wasn't a page turner for me. There was one review when I almost decided not to finish this book, I went on to Goodreads and I was looking at reviews because I wanted to be validated a little bit and I wanted to not be the only one who hated this book. And so I went on and I just looked at all the 1-star reviews and I was like, yeah, you get me. You understand where I'm coming from. And the best review that I read on Goodreads, it could be my favorite review of all time on Goodreads, and it was short, sweet, and to the point. And it was, writing this book was a crime and reading it was the punishment. That is how I felt. To a T, it was rough. But there were so many other people on Goodreads who talked about how kind of defining this book was for them and how much they truly, truly enjoyed the book and how riveting it was. And other people who would just say it was like life reforming, transforming. They loved this book. And as I said earlier, Jordan Peterson raves about this book. I mean, I get that he's a professor of philosophy. So, I mean, a book that's all about philosophy, or not, he's not a professor of philosophy, sorry. He's a professor of psychology. And for a book that is basically all about psychology and philosophy, I mean, I get why he completely loves this book. But really where I started to appreciate this book was after I had finished it. So 2 days ago, I finished this book. Spoiler alert, it is Thursday night, and this episode is supposed to air tomorrow morning. I'm going to be up really late editing this whole video and getting this posted in time to make sure that we hit tomorrow morning for all of my fans out there. And what I really enjoyed two days ago when I finished was when I started doing research for the episode. So I went into it and I was just, I mean, I didn't know what I was going to do for this episode. I was like, I don't like it. I don't even remember a whole lot of it. I don't feel like I retained a whole lot from this book. I can check it off my list, I guess. Honestly, after finishing this book, I probably couldn't even have told you all of the names of the people in this book because they all sound the same. You've got like Raskolnikov, the main character. You've got his best friend, Razumikin. You've got Svidrigailov. You've got the two women in this book are Sonia and Dunya. I'm like, seriously, could we have chosen harder names for me to remember? I'm terrible with names. And turns out I'm even worse with Russian names. Who would have thought? So I didn't really know what I was going to do with this episode of the podcast. But really where I feel like I came into my own on this episode was doing the research about this book. And that is what changed everything for me. This book, although not fascinating to read, is fascinating to study. I know that may seem weird, but I really, really, really liked the analysis of the book. And maybe it's just because I didn't pick up on it while reading it. I'm not very philosophical, or I didn't, most people in college, I think when you go throughout college, like the number one humanities class that everybody takes is psychology 101 or whatever. I think people enjoy it. From my experience in college, it was one of the easier A's, or humanities A's, I think, but also everybody thinks that psychology is fascinating. My humanities class, I think, was history of rock and roll. So if you can kind of see where most intellectuals are, they're on the, I want to take psychology 101 as my class. And me on the flip side, I was like, I want to take history of rock and roll and just listen to rock songs for an entire semester and just tell you who did them, what, different themes, different instruments. And that was my humanities credit in college. So when I say that I learned nothing in college, this is why I learned nothing in college. Also may have to do with the fact that my class selection was abysmal. But I am just not tuned in to those little, psychological discussion nuances, I guess, because everything in this book, like there were themes in this book and there were parts of this book that I got and I picked up on, but a majority of it flew right over my head. I would have to read this book like 10 times, and then I would have to listen to somebody lecture on it in order to really get everything out of this book that people seem to be able to like freely give you in about 15 minutes on YouTube. So I'm going to try to give some of the things, try to talk about some of the topics that I've learned, not from reading the book, but mostly from YouTube videos, oh my gosh, man, my rib hurts so bad. Sorry. Not from reading this book, but mostly from watching other people's YouTube videos or reading other people's papers, everything that I've been doing for the last 2 days to prepare for this episode of the podcast, because that's where I really felt like I got the meat of the story from. And that is when I really started to like Crime and Punishment. I think had I flipped it backwards and I had just listened to a bunch of people talk about the story and then read the book, I would have really, really enjoyed the book. I also think if I read it again, like reread it right now, I think I would really, really like the book. But reading it for the first time, being somebody who just doesn't pick up on those things, I felt like the meat of the book kind of went over my head and I missed out on a lot, which makes sense as to why I don't like it. I didn't like it originally because if I'm not picking up on the main purposes of the book, then the story had better be very entertaining. And I can tell you the story is not very entertaining in this book. So a couple things that I wanted to go over before we go over some of the things that I've learned are some fun facts about this. Well, about one, Dostoevsky, and then two, about this book that I learned while doing some of the research. So first off, Dostoevsky, I'm hoping I'm saying that right, grew up pretty upper middle class. His father was a doctor, and his father worked at a charitable hospital that the family actually lived kind of on the campus of that charitable hospital. So growing up, Dostoevsky actually saw quite a bit of poverty, and he also saw quite a bit of just in general some crazy crap from living in a charitable hospital. And it gave him a much different perspective from his peers because he was actually sent off to like a boarding school, and he had a very different perspective of the world from the kids that surrounded him. And it had a lot to do with what he saw growing up. And so in his 20s, he became friends with a kind of a radical group of writers and intellectuals that were very pro socialism. This was during a time of like feudal Russia. And so they were not well liked, obviously. And him and his friends were actually rounded up and sentenced to death by firing squad. But before the sentence could be carried out, the sentence was changed and he was sent to Siberia to work for 4 years in forced labor camps. And then after that kind of time in forced labor camps is when he kind of had a rediscovery of religion and really found his appreciation and love for religion and also started writing at the same time. Now, I think it's also really important to kind of talk about the time period in which these books were written. So in Russia kind of pre-Russian Revolution time period was extraordinarily religious, like Orthodox, Christian, everybody. And so it was kind of during this time period that atheism was starting to come about. And it was kind of crazy because, again, I've tried to learn more and more about Russian history. And what other book did I read recently about Russia? Oh, Animal Farm. Animal Farm, I did a little bit of Russian history. This book was a little bit of Russian history. And then I know I have the Gulag Archipelago coming up here pretty soon. I think I'm trying to just learn more about Russia in general. I also have Hunt for Red October coming up here pretty soon. So another Russian history, but not really Russian history as much as just Cold War, Russia, the bad guys kind of thing. But I'm trying to learn more about Russian history. But from my understanding, and I may be wrong, roast me in the comments if I'm wrong, but basically Russia had a pretty extreme transition from very Orthodox Christian to predominantly atheist in the matter of like 1 to 2 generations almost, which is why communism was able to really grab hold in Russia because of that complete kind of abandonment of kind of that Christian backbone of society that had existed for so long before that. And so a lot of Dostoevsky's books kind of have to deal with a lot of the kind of not theological per se, but a lot of more of the ideological as well as the psychological aspects of what it means to move from a kind of morals value, traditionally Christian-based value society or individual to somebody who does not value those, who does not have those same values, who basically gives those up for something completely different. So a more materialistic ego or materialistic or nihilistic view of the world in general. And so that is one of the major themes of Crime and Punishment, and something that I guess I didn't really pick up on at all until listening to some of these people talk about this book. So again, just good to have a little bit of background into Dostoevsky and where he's coming from and what he's writing about, because it's a lot of what's going on in Russia influences him and his writing. It's also important to note about when the book was written. So this is officially the oldest book that we've read here on the Bookly podcast and the oldest book that I've ever read outside of the Bible. So this book was first published in 12 monthly installments in a literature news, not newspaper, but literature magazine and it was published in 1866. 1866. I used to think that George Orwell wrote forever ago, and 1984 came out in 1949. Almost 80 years after Crime and Punishment. That's insane. Like, to just give you a little bit of perspective of when 1866 is, because I don't think people fully grasp like how long ago that really was. 1866, so 1865, the year before that, the Civil War ended. And 1867, the year after this was published, Canada became an independent country. And then 3 years later, so 1869, the first transcontinental railroad was completed. And then 1868, so 2 years after this book was published, helium was first discovered. So, I mean, we're talking a long, long time ago this book was published. It's also interesting what other books were kind of being published during the same time. I always think, I always try to imagine what is kind of influencing culture during this period of time. And so other books that were also published in the 1860s would be Victor Hugo's Les Mis. A lot of similar themes, I would say, to this book for sure. Poverty, and the ideas of right and wrong. And I mean, I think that there's a lot here. You've got Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. I have no idea what that book is about. I know it's important. Then you have Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. Did not know that book was that old. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Charles Dickens, Great Expectations. So a lot of kind of bangers, honestly, to be published here in the 1960s. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was a good 10 years for books, I guess. But diving in now into the book. So I've struggled a lot trying to figure out how to format this episode of the podcast. Most episodes of the podcast, if you haven't listened, are done primarily, I don't know, how would you say it? Primarily chronological throughout the book. So maybe not chronologically time-wise, but like page by page. I just go usually, chapter by chapter and talk about the book and talk about things that I learned as I was reading it, different impressions that I got, and, have a discussion with either myself. I mean, I monologue here by myself, or I talk with an individual if it's more of an interview style podcast episode. This episode, this is my fourth take on this episode. I've done this now 4 times, trying to figure out how the heck I'm going to do this episode, because like I said, I really struggled to really get things out of the book while reading it. And so my notes while reading are terrible. There's like 3 notes. It's awful. There's no way I could do a whole podcast episode based on that. And then I've got like 6 or 7 pages worth of notes from different things that I studied after reading this book. So I think what I want to do is I want to pull up one sec. I'm going to pull up one of these YouTuber people, and I kind of want to go over a couple different people's perspectives from YouTube and from different things that I read and just what I learned from them, because that was the part of the book that I think I enjoyed most. And so what is that called? I'll share their profile or share the video in the description so that you can look up some of my favorite videos. And then we're just going to go, I'll give them credit for whatever we did, just to get an idea of the overall plot of the book. So that, because I know that we read that original summary of the book, but the original summary of the book sucked. So I'm going to give you my 10-second summary. I'm going to give you my 2-minute summary of the book, and then we can dive into what some of the other people thought of the book. So Raskolnikov is this guy. He's a law student, and he lives in St. Petersburg, and he is handsome, and he is tall, and he is incredibly smart, super gifted, and he comes from a good family. He's got a sister who's also beautiful and also really smart, and they've got it all going on. The only thing that they don't have going on is money. And so they are absurdly poor. And Raskolnikov is one of these individuals who has recently, again, like I was talking about earlier, given up Christianity and become more of a atheist and more of an intellectually driven, kind of rational, rational moralist. I don't know if that's a word, but I mean, he thinks that his rational explanation for things kind of trumps the traditional morality of a Christian society. And he views himself as kind of a little bit more, superior, better educated, because he's able to make that leap and he's not bound down and been completely kind of boxed in by the traditional morality that everybody around him has. He feels like he's almost broken free and has discovered something new, has discovered this amazing new world because he has shed kind of the weights of traditional morality. And so he's a little bit of an arrogant individual. And he's got this best friend whose name is Razumikin. Razumikin is just another good dude, and they're both law students, and they're both friends. And Raskolnikov is going through a hard time because he's poor, like really poor. And he doesn't think he's supposed to be poor because he's so smart, and everybody around him is dumb because everybody around him still has this broken moral system of Christianity. And he's frustrated with the fact that he is poor. And he's frustrated that he has to do anything kind of underneath him that the normal individual would do, because normal individuals are dumb and he's not normal. He is extraordinary, and he's destined for greatness. He wants people to remember him in the history books. He wants everybody to be, he wants everybody to see how great he is. And so his best friend, Rasmukin, tries to give him basically every opportunity to succeed, tries to get him a job, and he's like, no, no, no. And instead, he's just kind of wallowing away in poverty. He's got nothing. He's back due on his rent. He doesn't have any food. He's got a mom and a sister still who love him, and his mom actually, and he's kind of, so that's where the story starts off. So the story starts off, he doesn't have any money anymore to pursue his education. He's in a really low place in life because he feels like he's broken free out of the chains of life, but now poverty is what's holding him down. And the story starts off, he gets a letter from his mother, and his mother sends him some money. And his mother doesn't have any money, but she explains that she takes an advance on her pension from, or whatever it is that they get. I don't know if it's pension, but her Social Security, her pension, whatever it is. And she takes an advance on it from a loan dealer and sends it to Raskolnikov. And that only makes him feel worse because, again, he's supposed to be providing for his family, and instead his mom is having to basically forego payments on any future payments and pay off this loan that he's getting. In addition to that, his mom states that his sister is actually engaged. However, the man that she's engaged to is kind of a bad person, I think would be an understatement. Ultimately, he's a rich lawyer who is going to marry his sister. His sister's name is Dunya. So this rich lawyer is going to marry Dunya because she is poor, so that and the reason the rich lawyer wants to marry a poor girl is because he wants the poor girl to be forever indebted to him, so that regardless of if they live in like a loveless marriage, which is what it would end up being, that the poor person always feels like they have to love or basically serve and can't do anything, and basically, serve and listen to this husband because it was the husband who lifted her out of poverty. Essentially, he wants to manufacture a savior complex in marriage, and that's what he was looking for with Dunya, and Dunya agrees to it. Dunya agrees basically to, sell her life to this man in order to provide financial stability for her family, because that's part of the deal, is that she would, marry into this loveless marriage, and this man would then allow for Raskolnikov to go to school, and Dunya is all excited because she's going to be helping her brother. But again, Raskolnikov doesn't like this. Instead of accepting the help and accepting the love of other people, again, he feels like he's above that he shouldn't be doing that. He is better than this help. And to make matters worse, he now has to go pawn the last of his belongings so that he can raise a little bit of money so he can continue to live. And so he goes to a pawnbroker to pawn his things. And this pawnbroker is just a terrible, terrible individual. And nobody likes her. Nobody in the entire town likes her. She's just mean and crotchety. And she's got this half-sister who's actually mentally handicapped, who she physically and mentally abuses. And she takes advantage of poor people. And she's, got all these, she's just not a good person. And so because of that, Raskolnikov breaks, and he decides that he can transcend the traditional morality of, thou shalt not kill, say that Christian morality. And it would be better off if he just kills this pawnbroker and steals from her because of all the good that he could do with it. So he decides that through one, I guess, traditionally terrible act, he can do so much good. He can pay off his debts. He can free his sister from that loveless marriage. He can free the mentally handicapped half-sister. He can go back to school and become a lawyer and then eventually do good as a lawyer. And again, because as an atheist and as a kind of rationalist, he is able to basically remove any morality from the question and just view this as a net good for society instead of what it really is, which is a murder and a terrible, terrible, terrible event. So that is what he comes to grips with. And so he decides to go, so he murders this pawnbroker, steals from her, and then essentially breaks down and is unable to grapple with the decisions that he has made. And he essentially becomes a new person who struggles with the ideas of guilt and who he saw himself as pre-murder and who he actually is post-murder. And so that is the story in a nutshell. If you are interested in learning more, read the book, because I'm not going to dive into the story completely, but that is all probably the first, I want to say chapter or 2 chapters is what that happens. And then after that, it's all more about like his psychological anguish and then eventually to his kind of redemptive arc at the very end. So there are a lot of other characters that I glossed over, but ultimately I wanted to kind of point out here that the part of the book that I thought was really good while reading it was the ability to create a character that had every reason to commit murder and even made sense from a strictly, tally sheet of good and evil of why he should commit murder. If you were to take morality out of the equation and just look at, net good for society, net bad for society, he had every reason to kill the pawnbroker. Pawnbroker bad, paying off his debts, freeing the sister, freeing his sister, freeing the niece, all good. So from a, kind of more nihilistic perspective, and maybe even from a more, or maybe not from a nihilistic perspective, but from a more, I don't know, not, I don't know what that word is, but not Christian perspective, not even, it would make sense to murder that individual. However, that's kind of what he ends up grasping, or what he ends up having to grapple with later in the future as he decides, whether or not what he did was good. Now, diving into kind of what I learned from studying the book instead of reading it. So, like I said, the meat of what I got from Crime and Punishment came from learning from other people who are much smarter than I am and had a lot of different ideas. One of those individuals being, like I said earlier, Unsolicited Advice. I will link him down in the description of this video. So if you're interested in watching some of his videos, I would highly recommend it. He seems like a smart dude. I did ask him if he wanted to be on the podcast. So we'll see if he wants to be on or if he ever even gets back to me. I've asked a lot of people if they want to be on the podcast, but this kid seems like he would be very, very good and have a lot to say. And somebody's perspective that I would really like to have on an episode. So we'll see what he says. But he seems like a very smart dude. And he breaks this episode of the podcast, he breaks down this book. Sorry, not this episode of the podcast. He breaks down this book, Crime and Punishment, into a couple different topics and then discusses those topics from the perspective of the book. I think there's like 6 topics that he breaks it down for. My favorite one that he does is he breaks it down from the idea, and these are just major ideas that are kind of grappled with in the book, Crime and Punishment. The biggest one that I got and the biggest one that I liked from his analysis of Crime and Punishment was the dangerous nature of superiority. So throughout this book, there are kind of 2 classes of individuals, according to Raskolnikov. According to Raskolnikov, there are 2 classes of individuals. There are kind of the lower class of individuals who are burdened by the historical morality of society and kind of are burdened by that restraint that is placed upon them. And then there are the, what are they called? I have it written here. Extraordinary men. Sorry. The extraordinary men is what they call them. The extraordinary men, or the people who can kind of rise above that and are not limited by the restrictions that are placed upon them, and instead can create their own moral framework and can make their own decisions. And those are kind of the 2 different individuals within this book. And the entire time, Raskolnikov creates this kind of dichotomy of people and sees himself as one of those great individuals. And at the same time, he is constantly throughout the book trying to get the appreciation and the respect and validation from those around him throughout the book. And this was kind of an idea, I think, that must have been pretty prevalent at the time, because I know Nietzsche kind of grapples with this idea as well. And I want to say this was pretty similar to the time frame of Nietzsche. But I know Nietzsche definitely grapples with this idea of the Übermensch. So again, it's kind of this idea of 2 classes of individuals. It was, this greater, superior being, and then kind of the common person. And then, I think that there were again, this was kind of this time period of nihilism and and rise of nihilism within Russia at the time. And so it's this idea that nothing matters and that there is no framework for morality, and you can rise above the traditional framework of morality and create your own framework for, decisions that you want to make. And so this book, Crime and Punishment, is essentially Dostoevsky's attempt to challenge that idea, I think would be the way that I'd put it, and challenge the idea and basically show the negative of what happens when somebody truly does believe that they are superior to others. And I think that that's an important topic, and I really like that this YouTuber kind of dives into that, because I think it's something that there are a lot of people nowadays that maybe do or have similar beliefs, but are unaware of those beliefs. People who feel like, I know that there's a common phrase that goes around, people who are above the law, they feel like that the rules that are placed upon them do not apply to them, that they are there for a greater purpose. I mean, one person that definitely comes to mind when I first think of this is, I can't remember who that I think he was a senator, maybe his house, something. But that guy that basically lied about everything, George Santos, I think was his name. He lied literally about everything to get into power. I don't know if he was somebody who had kind of that kind of morality complex or that kind of superiority complex where he felt like he was, he must have felt like he was above the law, right? How do you go around lying about literally everything? He lied about where he went to school. He lied about everything. He lied about his work experience. He lied about his family. He lied about his story. He lied literally about everything. He lied about, his genealogy. And I feel like in order to do that, you have to have a little bit of that kind of superiority complex. But it doesn't have to come with just just that example. I mean, it can be anybody who feels like they can make their own rules to life. Like they don't have to follow the rules set by society, because the rules set by society are meant to keep lesser beings down. And maybe you don't see yourself necessarily. I mean, really, yeah. I mean, that, I feel like there's just a lot of that going around. There's a lot of people, rules for, I don't know. But, another good example would have been maybe like COVID era. You had a lot of rules for thee, but not for me people. You had people that were making rules for masking, but then would be going and getting their hair cut while everybody else was, on lockdown, or were going and throwing parties in their backyard because they didn't need to keep the same code of morality of, protect your grandma, protect your cousin, protect your sister, that everybody else in the entire world were basically forced to do. Instead, they had their own code of rules that they were above because they knew better than you and they knew how everything worked. I think that's a perfect example, actually. That is on the fly while doing the podcast, while doing a monologue. That was a great moment for the Bookly podcast, because that's a great example of people who suffer from that kind of superiority complex. And Dostoevsky in this book goes to show how, one, that superiority complex is not sustainable in any form, because it just, there's a major flaw to the idea of it, but it also goes to show, what that as a individual can lead you to do. So, from a early perspective of the book, this idea of being superior and being above the rules of society is what allowed Raskolnikov in the first place to rationalize murder. So it may not be as extreme for you as an individual or for others. You might not be rationalizing murder, but it is what made the murder of the pawnbroker a possibility. That was the first step. The first step to murdering the pawnbroker was this idea that Raskolnikov was better than the rules. And that's in stark contrast to his friend Razumikin, who the entire time is in a very similar situation to Raskolnikov. He's a former law student and, he's not well off. He's poor. However, he's working. And he's working hard, and he looks out for other people, and he's charitable, and he's trying to help Raskolnikov this whole time. And then when Raskolnikov's family comes, he tries to help Raskolnikov's family, and he tries to get Raskolnikov a job. And eventually he takes care of Raskolnikov's sister and mother. And then he even follows Raskolnikov to Siberia when Raskolnikov is sentenced to prison. And it just goes to show kind of the difference between somebody who feels superior to others and somebody who doesn't feel superior to others. And it shows kind of the success and the happiness that's able to be derived from one, and the fulfillment that's able to derive from one, because really the best character in this book is Razumikin. He's the greatest character in this book as far as like lovable characters go. And then you have Raskolnikov on the flip side, who is kind of more of a, despised character, I would say, kind of very troubled character. And again, it comes from that superiority complex. So that it's the gateway to the entire aspect of this book, is him having that superior, kind of separating himself from others, kind of viewing himself as superior. And then that theme is then continued throughout the book. So throughout the book, he continues to have this idea of being superior to others, and he just wants people to know that he's superior. So he's got this constant internal struggle as an individual of feeling guilt and not wanting to get caught, but also kind of wanting to get caught at the same time, because he wants people to know that he is above the law, that he kind of transcended a morality and did everybody a favor by killing the nasty pawnbroker. And so the entire time throughout the book, he's kind of got this kind of flirting with telling people that he's the murderer, but also not, because he's guilty. And it creates this internal conflict in him, because he sees himself as better than them. But the only way that he can validate that feeling is by letting people know what he did, so that they can also tell him that you are better than, like, that he did it. Because as of right now, or as of the middle of the book, I guess, nobody knows that Raskolnikov killed the pawnbroker. And so because of that, they all think Raskolnikov is just like them, just poor, that he's poor, and that he's living his life, and he's just living it poor. And so he's got this kind of internal struggle where he wants people to know that he's better, that he's more important, and that he's kind of above them. And this basically comes to a head with, and is best demonstrated through Sonia. So Sonia is Raskolnikov's love interest in the book. And Sonia is a prostitute who is only prostituting because she needs to provide for her family. So Raskolnikov sees her as kind of an inferior being, or an inferior person, because of her decisions. And just like him, society also kind of sees her, or just like they would see him, as a murderer. I don't know. I think he kind of bonds over the fact that he's a murderer and she's a prostitute, and that they both do wrong things. However, for like in his mind, the right reason. I mean, she does it in order to provide for his family, and then he killed the pawnbroker in order to be great. So I think that's kind of what intrigues him with Sonia. However, at the same time, he's constantly looking for her approval to validate the fact that he's superior, and then also putting her down because he thinks that she's kind of this terrible individual who can't make decisions for herself. And it's just, he's very mean to her for a while, until the very end, when that's kind of the very, I guess that's like the dichotomy, is that he really, that's the hard part about it. I'm trying to articulate what it is, but it's that he views everybody as inferior, or he views, and specifically Sonia, he views Sonia as vile. And so he's trapped between wanting her approval, but also her approval not mattering because he's better than her. And so even if he gets her approval, it's not like it means anything, because he's a superior individual anyway, and he's just getting the validation of somebody who's inferior to him. So, but he can't be superior without getting the validation from Sonia. And so this conflict is constantly playing out in his head, where he is mistreating Sonia, and then, but also at the same time, kind of going back to her constantly, trying to get her to guess that he's this murderer, and to help her see how great he is. And it eventually comes to a head when he tells her that he is the murderer, and she tells him that he should confess and pay for ultimately his sins and go to prison. And he eventually does. And then even while in prison, he has a hard time coming to grips with the fact that he isn't superior. Even in prison, even after everything's all said and done, he still is trying to rationalize his murder as a superior act from a superior individual. And he doesn't really find any sort of closure as an individual until he gives up on the idea that he is superior and accepts Sonia's love and Sonia's comfort as an equal. And then that is when he kind of can shed everything from the murder and realize that, I don't know, I thought that was kind of the ending conclusion, is that he kind of feels himself an equal to Sonia and is able to then finally accept her love and be with Sonia. So I don't know if that made a ton of sense. Again, the guy from Unsolicited Advice explains it even better than I just did. And I would highly recommend listening to it because he does a very good job of just outlining kind of why that's so dangerous and also why Dostoevsky makes that a point to highlight. So again, that was really good. And then the other point that I really liked was from Jordan Peterson when he talks about Christianity and the kind of more nihilistic view that was sweeping across Russia at the time. So I think that was another major emphasis of the book, was to kind of combat this idea of nihilism. And I've heard really just Jordan Peterson say the word nihilism like 1,000 times. And anybody who's listened to anything Jordan Peterson has probably heard him say nihilism and nihilistic. And he calls a lot of people nihilistic and nihilistic tendencies and everything. And I'm just one of those people who never looked it up. I was like, man, I have no idea. So never knew what it meant. I just ignored that word. But I finally decided to look it up and understand what it meant, because it was even mentioned in the book, Crime and Punishment. He does say at the very end something about nihilism. I can't remember what the exact quote is, but nihilism, from a definition, I think from the Oxford Dictionary, says nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles. It is the belief that life is meaningless. And then just kind of diving further into nihilism, just so that people can understand, nihilism is the belief in nothing. And kind of to explain the belief in nothing, people often equate this to kind of the philosophical question of why. For religious people, the philosophical answer to the question why is kind of the eternal reward, or the kind of eternal perspective of this life being a test to receive an eternal reward. For some people who maybe not be as religious, the why to life could sometimes mean, like family and creating lasting bonds within family. For others, it could be, kind of setting your mark on the world and leaving kind of that impression on the world. And for a nihilist, the answer is nothing. Nothing matters. Nothing. There is no good. There is no evil. The why behind everything is nothing. You get to decide your own why, because nothing has any value. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of split between nihilism is that nihilism is not pessimism, because pessimism is the belief that nothing matters because eventually we all die and everything goes to crap. And it's got a very negative pointed view at things. Obviously if you're pessimistic, you're very, nothing matters. However, nihilism is not pessimism. Nihilism is more of a complete, it's neither good nor bad. There is no good. There is no evil. Evil and good were kind of was a morality framework created by humans, but it doesn't actually hold any weight. You can create your own individual framework for reality because nothing matters. I think that this is this was an idea that was kind of circulating around Russia at the time, and also an idea that I think circulates quite a bit today. Even on the internet, you'll see a lot of people. I think one of those kind of maybe nihilistic worldviews is kind of like the simulation theory, that we all live in a simulation. And so that's a kind of a more nihilistic viewpoint. Nothing matters because we all live in a simulation. There is no such thing as good and evil because, again, we all just exist, and that the purpose of everything is nothing. That is a very nihilistic viewpoint. Now, I also think it's important to recognize that there's also kind of this aspect of modern thinking where people try to recognize how small we are in the grand scheme of everything. You know, they say like nothing matters. And they do this as kind of like a coping mechanism. So they say like, oh, nothing matters in the universe, or nothing matters. Maybe not nothing matters. So maybe you're in a test and you get an F, and you're like trying to cope with the fact that you got an F on a test. And so you say, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, you know, in the grand scheme of the giant universe and things like that, you know, it doesn't matter. And I think that I think that's a healthy view of kind of the eternities and the universe and the endless nothingness of the world, because that kind of puts life, or puts some problems into perspective in your life. However, I think where it kind of starts to get dangerous is when you start to say that nothing matters at all, and you don't use it as a way to, I don't know, when you start to say like there is still no framework for good or evil, or any framework for anything, because nothing matters. So I think one of those perspectives that it doesn't matter because of the grand scheme of things, it gives you perspective, whereas nihilism kind of takes all perspective away and replaces it with nothing. So again, trying to wrap my mind around the idea of nihilism was kind of hard, because it is, in a literal sense, nihil is the Latin word for nothing, and ism is the Latin root for, you know, ideology. So it's the nothing ideology. So it literally means, you know, believing in nothing. So this was a kind of a sweeping trend across Russia during the time of Dostoevsky. It was something that started to raise concern with people, and also especially, you know, as individuals and in a younger group were starting to become a little less Christian-based values and starting to turn a little bit more, you know, atheistic, nihilistic, materialistic side of things. And that's a major theme within the book. Again, you can kind of start to see how these ideas were woven into some of the characters, especially Raskolnikov. So Raskolnikov I wouldn't say that he's completely nihilistic. However, he does kind of adopt this idea that the traditional framework of morality doesn't matter, that there is no objective good or evil, and that because of that, he can create his own sense of good and evil. And it then starts to, you know, it then leads to kind of this, that is what leads into his superiority complex, which then, like we talked about, is kind of the root of all of his problems. And there's another character in the book who kind of embodies this idea of nihilism kind of more fully. And I think he's a good character to set in contrast with Raskolnikov, because there's this character, Svidrigailov, in the book. So Svidrigailov is kind of, I don't want to say he's like the embodiment of evil, but he kind of is. He's a terrible individual. He looks out for himself, and he is in what I would classify as kind of the embodiment of nihilism, and kind of, the embodiment of nihilism into an individual. And you can definitely tell that Dostoevsky in this book was using him as kind of a warning for, what happens when somebody fully and truly believes and embraces this ideology of nihilism. Because as a character, I would say that Raskolnikov, he wants to believe that he is nihilistic. However, he can't fully grapple with it as an individual. And that's kind of his internal struggle. That's what makes him such a rich character, is that Raskolnikov wants to be nihilistic. Raskolnikov wants to be, completely, superior to other individuals. He wants to be everything that he thinks he is. He wants to be Napoleon. However, when rubber meets the road and he actually commits this murder, he can't really grasp, or he can't really grapple with that fact. He still is guilty, or he still feels guilt and remorse for killing these individuals. He can't completely shed the morality of society. And then in doing so, what he's trying to do is he's trying to get validation from what he would think is inferior individuals to help him feel better about the act that he just did, because he already feels bad because he doesn't truly believe in the kind of the nihilistic way. And so because of that, he's, grappling with this idea of inferior people, kind of validating him as a superior individual. And again, he doesn't fully commit to the ideal. And that's what kind of drives that internal conflict and makes him sick throughout the entire book, and leads him to be such a kind of a rich character that bounces back and forth between good and evil. He's constantly chewing people out, and then at the same time, he's trying to care for and help other people. And you can tell that he doesn't really understand who he is as an individual. On the flip side, Svidrigailov understands who he is as an individual completely. He's a guy who ended up marrying a rich lady and then didn't really like the rich lady anymore, liked the rich lady's employee, who happened to be Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister. And so he just kills his wife, steals all the money, has no qualms about it, doesn't feel bad. He's a person who he's not just evil, which is what makes him, I think, a very interesting character. And also, instead of being like an evil character, that's how I think you classify him, as like a nihilistic character. Again, there is not just evil within him. There is just no good or evil. So he gives a lot of money away. Like, he's constantly giving his money away to poor families or to individuals in need. He gives money to Dunya. He gives money to Raskolnikov, or he promises money to Raskolnikov. And he's at the same time about to marry a 16-year-old or a 15-year-old. And he just, killed his wife, and he talks pretty nastily and vilely about women and, kind of his sexual conduct with women. And at the same time, he's trying to bribe, essentially, Dunya to marry him because he's in love with Dunya. And so he's just got he's got no moral compass. Nothing to him is good or bad. Everything that he does is just what he wants in life and what he wants to do. So he is essentially what Raskolnikov views himself at, like wants to view himself as. And in the end, he ends up being, Svidrigailov ends up being kind of one of the most empty characters in the entire book, realizing that he can't just get whatever he wants. And he ends up committing suicide at the end of the book. And it again, is a very poignant criticism of the idea that, there is no good and there is no evil, and that you are your own moral framework. Because in the end, what he really wants is Dunya. However, Dunya despises him because of kind of the lack of moral framework. And so even somebody who doesn't believe in a moral framework, doesn't believe that there is good or evil, is still limited by the belief of good and evil from other people. So does it exist if you are limited by it? I mean, Dunya is disgusted with him because of his actions, because of his lack of belief. So he's affected still. So his life is still affected by the framework of morality. And in doing so, he realizes that he doesn't actually have control over everything in his life, and he commits suicide. So I think a very, very interesting critique of nihilism and of the kind of the effects of nihilism on an individual that, without the moral framework, one, you have an individual who's kind of a loose cannon in the book. He's nasty. People without this framework just, according to Dostoevsky, just are nasty individuals. But even kind of deeper than that, even with that lack of framework, they're still kind of bound by the framework of society because they live within society, I thought was very, very, very interesting. Again, I think there are just so many layers to this book that while reading it just went straight over my head. And then while doing research, I was like, holy cow, if you really wanted to learn about kind of the psychology of people and about a lot of the ideologies of Russia during this time, Dostoevsky does a phenomenal job of creating a story where you can both feel that, but feels both modern as well as like time specific to Russia, in that, it covers some of the most pivotal changes that were happening in Russia in the, kind of mid to late 19th century, the transition to atheism, kind of the expansion of nihilism and materialism and socialism and eventually communism. And then also at the same time creates a story that is completely, fascinating for today by, focusing on the idea of, guilt, conscience, the idea of superiority, the idea of, warring philosophies of, friendship, of just the psychology of even murder and the effects of, your surrounding situations, what it's like to be poor, what it's like to, feel like your entire life is being ripped out from underneath you, all of these kind of really still, even today, important topics that, again, it's very impressive that he was able to create a book and a story that kind of transcends both 2024 as well as 1866. So very, very, very impressive. The last thing that I learned from some of these documents that some of these YouTubers that I was listening to was kind of one of the characters. So Razmukin was Raskolnikov's friend. I know we talked about that earlier. One of the things that kind of was said that I really, really liked was this idea that Razmukin was the best friend that Raskolnikov could have ever had. So he's, I guess, in a lot of ways, kind of almost like the perfect friend. He looks over basically everything, all of the flaws of Raskolnikov. He looks over the fact that he is very prideful. He looks over the fact that he is very, I guess he has this kind of superiority complex. He looks over the fact that he's not providing for himself or his family and that he's not working. And, the entire time Razmukin is trying to help him get a job. He offered to let him translate for some of the books that he works with. I think he works as an editor or something, and he could pay Raskolnikov in advance for each of the books and help him survive. He helps take care of Raskolnikov when he's sick, and he takes care of Raskolnikov's family when Raskolnikov comes into town, and he takes care of Raskolnikov's sister, and he eventually marries Raskolnikov's sister. And then when Raskolnikov gets sentenced to prison to work in a forced labor camp in Siberia, Razmukin leaves, or Razmukin and his sister move to Siberia to be closer to Raskolnikov. And the crazy thing about this is that the entire time Raskolnikov views himself as superior and Razmukin as one of those kind of inferior individuals. He doesn't see, because Razmukin lives within the bounds of traditional societal morality, he views Rasmukin as kind of a lesser individual. And it's just one of those kind of things where, from what I was understanding from people, it's so interesting that that you can have people, that Raskolnikov could have somebody in his life like that, kind of that perfect friend, that person who always looked out for him, and still at the same time not see what everybody else reading the story sees, which is that the only good part of Raskolnikov's life is Rasmukin, and he doesn't even value that, and how kind of the superiority complex that Raskolnikov has destroys even, not destroys, because he still has his friendship with Rasmukin, but blinds him to the only good thing in his life. And how, that kind of intrinsic me, I'm the greatest mentality can really, it can do just that. It can blind you to all of the good in your life and blind you to even somebody who's debatably one of the greatest literary friends of all time, Rasmukin, and he's never once appreciative or, talks about Rasmukin in a way that would make him kind of one of the, and just kind of the idea that Rasmukin's the lesser individual and that Raskolnikov views himself as the greater individual, and how that should be essentially flip-flopped, and how, by living in the in the kind of traditional sense of morality and the moral construct of society, that Rasmukin is able to provide for not only himself, but also be able to provide for Raskolnikov's family, just goes to show how much Dostoevsky valued kind of the Rasmukins of the world. And I think that was just a very interesting point, and that he never, a lot of characters have, one flaw or two flaws or little flaws here and there, but Dostoevsky created this character to kind of show an almost complete contrast from both, Raskolnikov and also Svidrigailov, what is possible for somebody who is just good and doesn't have that superiority complex, and just, is hardworking, is, charitable, is, friendly, looks after their friends, and, he ends up having a great life and marrying Dunya and having everything that Svidrigailov wants, but, Svidrigailov doesn't get, because again, he isn't that. And so I thought that was good and an interesting character to kind of showcase the difference between individuals. And I think as a book, Crime and Punishment does that very well. It takes characters that maybe my first reading through, didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to, but now looking back on it and studying it a little more, you understand, why that character is important to the story. And it's maybe not because of them, maybe not because of what they do, but it's maybe because, how does it give light and contrast to some of these other characters? Like, how does Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister, kind of contrast the effects of Raskolnikov's character with hers? And so the writing is very intentional and very, very, I don't know, whatever his name is. Dostoevsky's playing like 3D chess, and I'm over here playing checkers. So that's kind of how I felt this entire book. And so, which is why I really enjoyed the analysis of this, because now after reading the book and understanding the story, now the analysis was really, really, really fun, and I really enjoyed it. So sorry if you didn't understand or like my analysis of the book or the things that I wanted to talk about and pick up. If you have read the book, those are some of the major themes in the book. If you haven't read the book, go into the book trying to pick out those themes. Again, the themes of, superiority, the themes of nihilism, the themes of kind of that abandonment of again, traditional traditional Christian values and this kind of more atheist, materialistic view on lives, and then just kind of start to look at the effects that has on the characters. And I think that was the major purpose behind this book, and what makes this book one of the great books of all time, because it provides a very interesting story to kind of those ideas. And yeah, I think most of that all just went over my head. So if it went over your head, then it went over, just letting you know, it went over my head too. So overall though, Crime and Punishment, what would I rank it? On a scale of 1 to 5 for importance, I would probably put it at a 5. Mostly because it is one of the, debatably one of the, greatest Russian literature books of all time. And it's, debatably probably a top 10 book of all time as far as recommendations go. It's definitely considered one of the classics. And it's had a major effect on basically all literature since 1866, which is crazy to me. So I would definitely give it a 5 on importance. Fun to read. I wish I could give this 2 different scores. Fun to read, I'd give it a 1. And fun to study, I think I would give it a 4, to be completely honest. I really, really enjoyed studying it. I enjoyed learning about these concepts. I think if I was more psychology and philosophy inclined, I think this book would be way more fun to read because I would pick out those things while reading it. However, while reading it, it just seemed like a very slow-moving murder story instead of what it really was, which was a very well-crafted critique of philosophical and psychological study or theories. So reading it for me personally, enjoyment 1, studying 4. I would definitely recommend it if you are somebody who really does enjoy kind of those high level kind of thinkings. And if you're not somebody who doesn't, then maybe I would go on YouTube. I would recommend going on YouTube and just, watching a bunch of videos about Crime and Punishment. And then if you are interested after that, then go and read the book. I wish I had done it backwards. I wish I had learned more about the book and then read it. This is the first book that I wish going into it that I had just known all of the spoilers and known, all of the backstory of the book and spent a lot of time studying the book before reading it. Most books, it's the other way around. Most books, I enjoy reading it first and then kind of going in and studying it and getting more of a backstory. This book was completely backwards. I wish I had studied it more. So if you fall into that same category, that's what I would recommend. Definitely listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson. He absolutely loves this book. Lex Friedman, he absolutely loves this book. And then there are plenty of YouTubers who have talked in length about Crime and Punishment. My favorite out of everybody that I listened to was definitely Unsolicited Advice. Definitely give him a check him out, give him a like, a subscribe or whatever. He's got quite a bit of followers, so we'll see. If we can get him on the podcast, that would be great. Otherwise, let me know who else you'd like to see on the podcast. And if you liked this episode of the podcast, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure that you give us a 5-star review. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, if you'd like to see anybody on the podcast, let me know. And if you are somebody who listens but would like to be on the podcast, let me know, because these solo episodes are kind of rough sometimes. Again, I try to get all my thoughts together, but I swear I'm just kind of scatterbrained and I don't like to have it all written down. I tried doing that. This is my 4th time recording this one because I had it all written down and then didn't like the way that it came out. And so I'm definitely a rambler and I wanted to just redo it over and over and over again. And so because of that, I'm sure some of this was kind of confusing. So if you don't want confusing episodes like this, help me get guests. Just kidding. We have a couple guests coming up here pretty soon. Next week's episode is a special episode with Olivia as the host. So tune in for that. That'll be super fun. And then that'll be with The Bodyguard. And then we've got a episode with kind of that with a random individual, and we are reading Hunt for Red October. And then I've got an episode with somebody else new here in town, a local kind of business owner, and we're going to read The Obstacle is the Way. So those are the next 3 episodes coming up. Stay tuned. I'm super excited about them. And yeah, thanks for listening to the Bookly Podcast.